I started writing down everything a 9-year-old told me about his stepdad. It became evidence in an attempted murder case. The question came from Theo Whitfield, 9 years old, over grilled cheese on a Tuesday in March. Did Grant still get the house if mommy didn't come home? I laughed it off, told him of course his mom was coming home. She was just running late at the office. And did he want the crusts cut off or not? He said not, like always, and ate his sandwich. And I filed the question away in the part of my brain that files things and forgot about it, or told myself I had. 6 weeks later, I was standing in the Whitfield's kitchen at 9:14 p.m., phone in one hand, a cold spatula in the other, watching that exact scenario play out in real time. Renee Whitfield was somewhere on Route 9, 40 minutes past when she should have walked through the door. Her phone was going straight to voicemail. Theo was upstairs, supposedly asleep. Grant was in the living room with the TV on low, and every time I passed the doorway, he looked up at me with an expression I could not read, and I understood, standing there with my heart going too fast for a kitchen this quiet, that I already knew the answer to Theo's question. I just hadn't let myself say it out loud yet. I'm Josie Callahan. I was 24 that spring. One semester short of a social work degree, I'd had to pause when my dad's hours got cut at the plant. Working as a nanny to pay rent on an apartment I split with a roommate who worked nights. Saving toward tuition in an account I tried not to look at too often. I'd been with the Whitfield family 8 months by then. Hired 6 weeks after Renee married Grant Iverson. At a rate that felt almost too generous for someone still fuzzy on the difference between a trust and a will. I did not know yet how much that vocabulary would come to matter, or how fast I'd have to learn it. Theo was easy to love from the first week. He had a poster of Saturn's rings taped up crooked above his bed because he'd insisted on hanging it himself, a stuffed axolotl named Ramen that he pretended he'd outgrown but still slept holding by one leg, and a habit of narrating facts about neutron stars at anyone who made eye contact with him for longer than 3 seconds. He was in 3rd grade, reading 2 levels above it, and terrible at tying his shoes, and none of that struck me as strange, because none of it was. Renee worked as a billing supervisor at the regional hospital system, the kind of job that made her precise about numbers in a way that would matter later more than either of us guessed. She kept a chipped mug shaped like a brontosaurus on the kitchen counter that had belonged to Adrian, Theo's biological father, who'd died in a single car accident on a rain-slicked curve of Route 9 3 years before I ever met this family, when Theo was 6. She never got rid of the mug. Their dog Waffles, an aging beagle mix with a gray muzzle, slept under the kitchen table and barked at nothing in particular, usually the mail carrier. There was a grocery list stuck to the fridge in Renee's handwriting that said milk, granola bars, dog food for at least 3 weeks running, because nobody in that house ever remembered to actually buy the dog food. Grant was, by every visible measure, a good stepfather. He worked as an independent insurance adjuster, which meant he was fluent, more fluent than either Renee or I ever were, in the language of policies, riders, beneficiaries, payout schedules. He coached Theo's rec league soccer team on Saturday mornings and remembered, without fail, to ask about neutron stars before Theo could even finish bringing them up. He was charming with other parents at pickup in the specific, practiced way that made you like him before you'd fully decided to, the kind of charm that made you feel, afterward, a little foolish for having been charmed. Adrian's parents, Judith and Walt Whitfield, still came for Sunday dinner most weeks, and Grant was unfailingly warm to them too, which Renee had told me, early on, was one of the things that had made her trust him in the first place. A man secure enough not to be threatened by a dead man's parents at his own table. Renee and Grant had met 18 months after Adrian died, at a grief support group she'd only gone to twice, held in the basement of a church neither of them attended. Grant wasn't a widower himself. He told her, that first night, that he'd lost his own father young and understood grief well enough to sit in a room full of it without flinching, which was more than most people his age could say. Renee told me once, in an entirely different context, back before any of this started, that what she'd loved about him early on was how unhurried he was. He never pushed. He let her set every pace. How fast they dated, when he'd meet Theo, how long before he moved in, how long before the wedding. In hindsight, sitting across from Detective Castellane months later, she would describe that same unhurried quality in a completely different tone of voice, and I understood exactly what she meant, because I'd sat across a kitchen table from him myself plenty of times, admiring the same patience. I remembered my interview for the job back in the fall. Renee had asked the practical questions, my availability, my references, whether I had a car that ran reliably in winter. Grant had asked me instead what I thought a 9-year-old actually needed from an adult who wasn't his parent. I'd given some answer about consistency and honesty, the kind of answer a social work program trains you to produce on command, and he'd nodded slowly, like I'd said something more insightful than I had, and told me he thought trust was the whole game, that once you had a kid's trust, everything else followed. I remembered thinking, driving home that day, that I'd never heard a stepfather talk about a kid he barely knew with that much intention. It had seemed like a point in his favor at the time. It took me 8 months to understand it as something else entirely. The one hard rule in that house, the one Renee had been firm about from the very start, was that Theo wasn't ready to call Grant dad. It had been 14 months since the wedding. Judith and Walt were still very much in Theo's life. Renee wanted her son to arrive at that word on his own schedule, if he ever did, and not have it handed to him before he was ready. Grant had agreed to it, in front of me, in the calm and unreasonable voice he used for nearly everything. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The first time I noticed the loop, it looked like nothing at all. I picked Theo up from school on a Thursday, and he climbed into the back seat and said, apropos of nothing, Grant said it can be our little secret if I call him Dad when Mom's not around. He said it doesn't count if nobody's filming. I told myself that was just a kid repeating something an adult had said in a joking, throwaway way, the kind of thing a stepdad says to feel closer to a boy who isn't ready to give him the word yet. I told myself it wasn't my place to relitigate a boundary Renee had already set with her husband. I did not write it down. I told myself, driving home, that I was the kind of person who overthought things, a habit left over from a semester spent reading intake files for a professor who wanted us to find the red flag in every case study, whether or not one was actually there. The second time, a week later, Theo asked me at lunch, not dinner, not bedtime, lunch, apropos of a math worksheet about coins, whether it was stealing if something was already going to be yours anyway. I asked him what he meant. He shrugged, the specific shrug of a kid deciding a conversation isn't worth having, and went back to his worksheet like he hadn't said anything at all. I pressed gently, one more time, asked if this was still about the worksheet or about something else. He said, something else, and then wouldn't say what, and picked his pencil back up like the door had closed on its own. Something in my stomach did a small, cold turn I couldn't name yet, and I let it go, because letting it go was easier than the alternative, and because I had exactly no evidence yet that a 9-year-old's strange question about coins was anything more than a 9-year-old being strange, the way 9-year-olds sometimes are for no reason at all. The third time, he stopped eating lunch, not dramatically. He'd push the food around his plate, ask to be excused early, and then find me in the laundry room or the garage 15 or 20 minutes later with a question that didn't sound like a 9-year-old's question at all. If mommy doesn't come back from somewhere, does Grant still get to be my dad on paper? I told him his mom was fine and always came back, which was true, and asked him gently where he'd heard the word paper used that way. He said Grant used it a lot. On paper. Official. I still didn't write it down. I told myself I was pattern matching where there was no real pattern, the way you do when you've spent a semester learning to see one everywhere. The fourth time broke that. Theo came to find me while I was folding laundry in the hallway and asked, in the same flat voice he used for neutron stars, what days his mom took the blue pills, because Grant had asked him and Theo didn't remember and didn't want to get it wrong. Renee didn't take blue pills. She took a beige generic for her blood pressure in a bottle that lived in the cabinet above the microwave, and it was white, not blue. I asked Theo, very carefully, when Grant had asked him that. He said at breakfast that morning while Mom was in the shower. I asked if Grant had said why he wanted to know. Theo thought about it in the serious, deliberate way he thought about everything, folding one sock into a ball and then unfolding it again, and said Grant had told him it was for her health so we can help her remember, which was the kind of answer that sounds reasonable coming from an adult and sounds coming secondhand out of a 9-year-old at 4 in the afternoon, like something with the floor cut out from under it. I went into the downstairs bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the tub for 4 full minutes before I could make my hands stop shaking enough to type anything into my phone at all. That night, I bought a cheap spiral notebook at the drugstore on my way home and started what I would later, when it mattered in ways I couldn't have predicted, learn to call a contemporaneous log. Dates. Exact quotes, as close as I could reconstruct them, written the same day so memory couldn't round the edges off in my favor or anyone else's. Nothing embellished, nothing interpreted. The one discipline my unfinished coursework had actually managed to drill into me before the money ran out. I wrote, March 14th, Theo said, Grant said it can be our little secret. Ray, calling him Dad, doesn't count if nobody's filming. I wrote, March 21st, Theo asked if it's stealing when something is already going to be yours. I wrote, March 28th, Theo asked what days Mom takes the blue pills. Said Grant asked him this at breakfast while Renee was in the shower. I did not tell Renee yet. I told myself I needed more before I said anything that could cost me a job I needed badly and possibly detonate a marriage over what might still technically be nothing. The 5th entry came 2 days later, and it was the one that finally moved me to say something out loud, even if only to a notebook. I was in the kitchen when Grant came in from the garage and asked casually whether I knew Renee's usual route to her sister's place across the county, the back way, past the reservoir, or the highway, because he wanted to surprise her with flowers along the way sometime. It was such a small, ordinary-sounding question. I told him I didn't actually know, which was true. I wrote it down anyway, because by then I'd stopped believing anything in that house was small. The 6th entry, a week after that, was the one I almost didn't write down at all, because on its face it was the most innocuous of them. Grant asked Theo to help him practice a story for a school project. A made-up scenario, he said, about what a family would do if Mom had to travel for work suddenly. Theo told me about it that night, proud of himself, repeating the practice story, almost word for word, that if Mom went away, he and Grant would stay in the house, and Grant would take him to soccer, and it would all be fine, because Grant already knew how to do everything Mom did. He'd said the line with a kind of rehearsed confidence, the cadence of a kid who'd been asked to say something back correctly more than once until he got it right. Grant said I did really good remembering all of it, he told me, pleased with himself in a way that made my chest hurt. I asked him if he liked practicing the story. He said it was kind of boring actually, because Grant made him say it 3 different times, but Grant said the 3rd time was the best one, and that's the one that counted. There was no school project. I checked with his teacher the next morning, a woman woman named Ms. Okafor who'd taught 3rd grade for 11 years, and looked at me like I'd asked her something faintly insane when I brought it up. No such assignment existed, she said, and none had been assigned all year. I didn't get the chance to decide when to finally tell Renee. She found out for me 3 days after that when she borrowed my tote bag to run Theo's forgotten library books back to school, and the spiral notebook fell out onto her kitchen counter, spine up, open to the page about the blue pills. I came downstairs to find her sitting at the table with it in front of her, both hands flat on either side of it, like she was afraid it might close on its own if she let go. I braced for her to fire me on the spot. Instead, she looked up at me and her voice when it came was very quiet. She asked if I had more pages like that one. I said yes. She asked me to keep going. That was the moment the story stopped being about a stepdad with a boundary problem and turned into something else entirely, though it took the two of us a while, sitting at that table until almost midnight, to say the something else out loud. Renee told me things that night I hadn't known and hadn't been in a position to know. That Grant had, 3 months into the marriage, started asking pointed questions about Adrian's trust, the one Adrian had set up before he died, worth just over $1.3 million, held for Theo until his 25th birthday, with Renee named sole trustee. That Grant had raised more than once, for peace of mind, in case anything ever happened to you. The idea of adding himself on as a co-trustee. That she'd stalled every single time, and every time she stalled, he'd let it drop so gracefully, it made her feel almost paranoid for having hesitated at all. That 6 weeks earlier, going through the mail, she'd found a life insurance statement addressed to her from a policy she didn't remember increasing, the death benefit raised from $150,000 to $800,000, with a beneficiary change form attached that carried her signature, in a slant she didn't fully recognize as her own. She'd meant to call the insurance company about it. She hadn't gotten around to it yet, because there was always something more urgent, and because some small, self-protective part of her hadn't wanted to know the answer. She told me other things too. Smaller things she hadn't thought to mention to anyone because none of them, alone, sounded like anything. That Grant had gently steered her, over 14 months, away from the 2 girlfriends she used to see every other week, always with a reasonable-sounding excuse. He'd point out, mildly, that one of them talked badly about her ex-husband's memory, that the other seemed to resent how happy Renee had become, that he'd started, in the last few months, asking to see her phone just to check something, often enough that she'd stopped thinking of it as unusual, that he knew her work schedule down to the hour and would sometimes call the hospital switchboard directly if she didn't answer her cell inside a few minutes, something she'd once found touching and had more recently started finding exhausting in a way she hadn't let herself examine. None of it, she said, had ever felt like danger. It had felt like devotion, right up until the night a stranger's handwriting on a beneficiary form made her wonder how much of the devotion had been real. Hearing herself say all of that out loud, at her own kitchen table, with my notebook still lying open between us, she started to cry, and I didn't know yet whether I was allowed to hug my employer, so I just sat there with my hand on her arm until she stopped. We started documenting together after that night. It felt, on some evenings, like playing detective in our own house, and on other evenings it felt like the least paranoid thing either of us had ever done in our lives. We learned over the next 2 weeks that Grant had met twice with a family law attorney named Colton Reyes about what his intake sheet, which Renee photographed off Grant's laptop one night while he was in the shower, hands shaking so badly the first 3 pictures came out blurred, called blended family estate contingencies. We learned through the insurance company's customer service line that the beneficiary change form had in fact already been processed, and that a supervisor there, a man named Owen Ferris, would need Renee to come in personally with photo ID to formally dispute it, because a signature dispute wasn't something they were able to resolve over the phone. We sat in Owen Ferris's small office 2 days later while he pulled the form up on his screen, turned the monitor toward Renee, and watched her go pale looking at a signature that was close enough to hers to have fooled a computer system and not close enough to have been written by her own hand. We learned that Grant had a storage unit 30 minutes away that Renee had never known existed, paid for in cash under a slightly misspelled version of his own name that showed up nowhere in their shared accounts or their joint tax filings. And we learned, because Renee finally called her old college roommate, who happened to have gone into paralegal work at a firm 2 states over, that Grant had been married once before. His first wife, a woman named Marisol Fenn, had drowned in a boating accident on a lake in another state 6 years earlier. Grant had been the sole beneficiary of a policy worth $850,000. The death had been ruled accidental. Nobody at the time had had any particular reason to look closer, because nobody had known to ask the questions we were now asking. Renee hired an estate attorney of her own the following week, a woman named Elena Marsh, sharp-eyed and unhurried, who kept a legal pad in front of her the entire first meeting and filled 4 pages without once looking up. She read my notebook front to back in that meeting without saying a word, flipped back twice to check a date against something Renee had said earlier, and then looked up and asked flatly, "Has anyone called the police yet?" Nobody had. We did that the next morning. The detective assigned to us was a woman named Naomi Castellane, 19 years with the department, most of them spent in family crimes. She sat at Renee's kitchen table, the same table, the Brontosaurus mug still on the counter behind her, and read the notebook the way Elena Marsh had, slowly, methodically, flipping back twice to check one entry against another. At one point she asked me, without looking up whether I had ever embellished an entry to make something sound worse than it was. I said no. She nodded like that was the answer she'd needed, and kept reading. None of this, taken piece by piece, is a crime, she told us afterward, and I felt something in my chest drop before she kept going. A man asking his stepson what pills his mother takes isn't a crime by itself. A man meeting with an estate attorney isn't a crime. Even a forged signature, if that's what this turns out to be, starts out as a civil matter until we can show intent to defraud, or worse. She tapped the cover of the notebook twice with one finger. But a pattern is a pattern, and a second wife with a doubled policy sitting next to a first wife at the bottom of a lake is exactly the kind of pattern that gets other departments' attention fast, once somebody actually goes looking. Give me a few days. A few days turned into 11. In that time, Detective Castellane pulled the 11-year-old closed file on Marisol Fenn's drowning and found that the original investigating department had never run the numbers on the payout against Grant's finances at the time of her death. He had been 6 figures in debt from a failed marine supply business, and the policy had cleared it inside 4 months of her funeral. She tracked down a retired detective from that department, a man named Silas Okonkwo, who remembered the case well enough to still have his old notes in a box in his garage, and who told her, almost apologetically, that a neighbor of the Fenns had come forward at the time with a small, strange detail nobody had followed up on, that she'd overheard Marisol, weeks before she died, tell a friend on the porch that Grant kept asking whether she'd finally updated her beneficiary paperwork. It hadn't fit the story anyone was already telling themselves about a tragic, ordinary accident, so it had gone into a file and stayed there. There was a stretch, in the middle of all this, where it looked briefly like we might be wrong. Grant produced, unprompted, what looked like a plausible explanation for the storage unit. Old equipment from the marine business, he said. Nothing sinister. And for 2 days, Detective Castellane treated that as a real possibility, because she said good investigators have to be willing to be wrong. It was Elena Marsh who found the hole in it. The storage facility's own records showed Grant had opened the unit 8 months earlier, 4 months after his wedding to Renee, not carried over from any failed business a decade in the past. The explanation collapsed the moment anyone checked the date on it, and Detective Castellane told us afterward that the collapse told her more than the storage unit itself did. An honest man doesn't need to invent a timeline. Elena Marsh, meanwhile, walked Renee through what it would take to freeze Grant off the trust and revoke his access to any shared accounts without tipping him off before there was enough on paper to make it stick. A judge named Everett Kwan, who Elena said had handled 2 similar cases in the past and had a low tolerance for being lied to in his courtroom, signed an emergency order restricting Grant's access to the accounts, effective the following Monday, pending a formal hearing. Renee was told to behave normally until then. Normal, in that house, now meant something none of us could have described a month earlier. Normal meant smiling at breakfast while wearing a body camera's worth of dread. Dr. Priya Anand, a child psychologist Elena recommended, started seeing Theo twice a week. She was gentle and unhurried with him, let him talk about Saturn's rings for the first 15 minutes of every session before she asked him anything harder. She told Renee and me separately in a windowless little office that smelled like a candle trying too hard to smell like nothing, that what Theo had been experiencing had a clinical name. She called it coached disclosure pressure, the deliberate, repeated use of a child as an information channel and a loyalty test. He knows something is wrong, she told us. He's known longer than either of you gave him credit for. Kids almost always do. What he doesn't know yet is that it wasn't his job to figure it out, and it definitely wasn't his job to keep it a secret from his mother. That's the part we're going to spend the most time on. Renee was allowed to sit in on one session, near the end of that first month, and asked me to come too, since Theo had brought up my name unprompted more than once. Dr. Anand had Theo sorting a deck of cards printed with faces showing different feelings, while she asked him, in the same unhurried voice she used for everything, whether it ever felt like he had 2 different jobs, one for when Mom was around, and a different one for when it was just him and Grant. Theo sorted 3 cards before he answered. The Grant job is remembering stuff and not telling, he said, like he was reciting a chore list. The Mom job is just being normal. Dr. Anand asked him which job felt heavier. He thought about it for a long time, longer than he usually thought about anything, and said, the not telling one. It's heavy like when you hold your backpack the wrong way and one shoulder hurts more. Renee's hand found mine under the little play table and gripped it hard enough to leave a mark. Neither of us said anything the entire drive home. The Monday of the account freeze came and went without incident, which should have told us something on its own. Grant didn't confront Renee. He didn't ask a single question about the accounts. If anything, he got warmer, more attentive, the kind of performance that, in hindsight, read less like innocence and more like a man deliberately buying himself room to move. Detective Castellane called it consistent with the pattern she'd already built. She told Renee plainly not to be alone with him if she could help it, and to call her immediately, day or night, if he pushed, even gently, for Renee to go anywhere by herself. He pushed 9 days later. Grant told Renee on a Wednesday evening that Colton Reyes had drafted updated guardian designation paperwork for Theo's sake and needed her signature notarized before the end of the week. Nothing to do with the trust, he said, just standard blended family housekeeping. And there was a notary 2 towns over who could see her at 7 that evening after Theo's bedtime, so it wouldn't eat into the day. He offered to drive her. She said she'd rather go alone, clear her head. He'd He didn't argue. He kissed her goodbye at the door and told her to drive safe. And I remember standing in the front hall with Theo's backpack still slung over my shoulder, thinking that phrase had never once sounded ordinary to me, not since the first line in that notebook. She left at 6:41 p.m. She was supposed to be home by 8:15. By 8:01, I told myself notaries run late. By 8:20, I told myself traffic on Route 9 backed up sometimes near the reservoir construction. By 8:40, her phone was going straight to voicemail. No rings first. The flat, immediate kind that means a phone is off or already dead, and I stopped being able to invent reasons. By 9, I had texted her 4 times and called twice, and Theo, who was supposed to be asleep, was standing barefoot at the top of the stairs in his pajamas asking me if mommy was coming home, and I told him yes, of course she was, in the same voice I'd used over grilled cheese 6 weeks earlier, and I did not believe myself any more than I had then. He asked if he could sit with me in the kitchen instead of his room. I said yes. He brought ramen down with him and sat on the stool nearest the door, watching it the way you watch a pot you've been told will eventually boil. My hands wouldn't stop shaking around my own phone. My stomach had dropped somewhere around 8:45 and hadn't come back up. Grant paced the living room with his own phone in his hand, and every time he passed the kitchen doorway, he looked at me, and I could not tell if what I saw in his face was worry or something colder wearing worry's shape. At one point, he stepped out onto the back porch to make a call I couldn't hear, and came back in a different man than he'd walked out as, steadier, blanker, and something about the steadiness scared me more than the pacing had. At 9:14, Detective Castellane called me instead of Renee, on a number Renee had given me 2 weeks earlier with instructions to use it the moment anything felt wrong, which I had never expected to actually have to do. I stepped into the laundry room and shut the door so Grant wouldn't hear. "Josie," she said, "I need you to stay calm and tell me exactly what Grant has said to you tonight. Every word you can remember." I told her about the notary, the route, the offer to drive that Renee had turned down. There was a pause on the line I didn't like at all. "There's no notary open past 6 anywhere on Route 9 in that direction," she said. "I checked 20 minutes ago, before I called you. State troopers are already looking for her car. Stay with the boy. Do not let Grant leave that house with him, not for any reason. I'm sending a unit to you now." Officer Dana Whitlow arrived at 9:31, badge out before she'd finished crossing the porch, and asked Grant to step outside to answer some questions about his wife's whereabouts, in a tone that gave him no real room to say no. I stood in the kitchen with Theo pressed against my side, his stuffed axolotl forgotten upstairs on his pillow, both of us watching through the window as Grant's face did something I had never once seen it do in 8 months. The practiced calm finally, visibly, cracking down the middle. Renee's car was found at 9:52, nose down in the drainage ditch on the reservoir bend of Route 9, half a mile from where the road curved hardest. She was conscious when the paramedics reached her. Seatbelt the only reason she wasn't worse off than she was. Airbag deployed, a gash along her hairline and a fractured wrist from bracing against the wheel. A tow truck mechanic, at the state trooper's request, found within the hour that the brake line had been tampered with, compromised in a way engineered to hold for the first several miles and fail exactly where the road curved hardest around the reservoir. The same stretch, Detective Castellane would tell us later, close enough to where Adrian Whitfield had died 3 years before, that she went back and requested his old accident file that same night, just to be certain there wasn't a second pattern hiding under the first one. Grant was arrested at the house at 10:47 p.m., not for the brake line yet, since that would take the state lab another 9 days to confirm and match to tools eventually recovered from the storage unit, but on the emergency protective order violation and, within 48 hours, on a charge of attempted murder that the district attorney's office built, count by count, on top of everything Detective Castellane had already assembled: the doubled policy, the forged beneficiary form, the guardian paperwork that had never actually been filed with any court despite what Grant had told Renee, and reopened now with real urgency instead of a box in somebody's garage, the 11-year-old case of a woman named Marisol Fenn, who had gone into a lake with a policy on her head and come out of it a closed file nobody had thought to question. Bail was set at $500,000. Judge Kwan denied the defense's motion to lower it, citing flight risk and the age of the second uninvestigated death. The search warrant on the storage unit was executed 2 days after the arrest, and Detective Castellane walked us through the inventory herself because she said Renee had earned hearing it from her instead of from a headline. Inside, alongside the marine business equipment Grant had claimed as the innocent explanation, officers found a fireproof lockbox containing copies of both insurance policies, Marisol's from 6 years earlier and Renee's current one, printouts of state inheritance law with sections underlined in the same blue pen, a folder of receipts from the same auto parts supplier twice over, 6 years apart, and a spiral-bound notebook of his own, far less carefully kept than mine, half filled with notes, in Grant's handwriting that read less like a diary and more like a project log. Dates, dollar figures, a running list titled, without apparent irony, things that need to be in place first. Detective Castellane said it was the closest thing to a written confession she'd seen in 19 years that wasn't actually a confession, because nowhere in it did he ever write down what the plan was for. He hadn't needed to. Everything else in the box did that work for him. I thought that first week that the worst of it was over. It wasn't, quite. 10 days after the arrest, Colton Reyes's office was subpoenaed for the guardian designation file, and what came back wasn't the tidy, if fraudulent, paperwork we'd expected. It was evidence evidence that Reyes himself had never actually drafted or filed anything with any court, that the paperwork Grant had described to Renee had never existed in the form he'd claimed, and that Grant had shown Renee a mocked-up document he'd assembled himself on a template using Reyes's letterhead lifted from an old, unrelated email. Reyes, horrified and cooperative once he understood what his name had been used for, turned over every file he had. It meant the DA's office had to rebuild part of the case around forgery rather than a corrupt attorney, which set the trial date back 2 more months and meant Renee had to sit through a second, longer deposition explaining, again, exactly when she'd realized the paperwork wasn't real. It wasn't the ending any of us wanted right after an arrest that already felt like the hardest thing we'd survive. It was one more proof, Detective Castellane told us, of how far Grant had been willing to go to make a story hold together, and one more piece of evidence, once it was untangled, that made the case against him harder to argue away. Judith and Walt came to the hospital the night of the accident and didn't leave the waiting room until a nurse finally let them in to see Renee at almost 2 a.m. Walt, who I'd never once seen without a steady, easy smile at Sunday dinner, sat in a plastic chair with his hands pressed flat against his knees and didn't say a word for almost an hour. Judith asked me quietly, in the hallway, whether Adrian's death had really been an accident after all, and I told her the truth, which was that Detective Castellane hadn't ruled anything out yet, and neither should we. She nodded like she'd expected that answer and hated it exactly as much as I did. It would be another 6 weeks before the state lab could say with reasonable confidence, based on tire and skid evidence too degraded after 3 years to prove intent, that Adrian's crash had almost certainly been exactly what it looked like at the time, a genuine accident, unrelated, a coincidence of geography and a bad curve in the rain. Judith cried harder hearing that it wasn't connected than she had at the possibility that it was, she told me later, because it meant she'd have to go on being angry at 2 separate tragedies instead of getting to fold them into one. Renee spent 3 nights in the hospital and came home with her wrist in a cast and, for a while, a version of herself that flinched at the sound of car doors closing too fast. Elena Marsh had the account freeze made permanent within the week, and Judge Kwan signed off on emergency sole custody of Theo pending the divorce. No contact pending trial. Marisol Fenn's sister, tracked down by Detective Castellane during the reopened investigation, called Renee directly one evening in May, a call neither of us was prepared for, just to say, in a voice that broke twice over the course of it, that she'd spent 6 years being told by everyone around her that she was the only person who'd ever thought something was wrong with how her sister died, and that she was glad, in the strange and complicated way you can be glad about something born out of somebody else nearly dying too, that this time someone had actually looked. I testified twice, once at the emergency hearing to keep Grant away from the house and away from Theo pending trial, once, months later, in front of a grand jury, reading from the same water-stained spiral notebook, page by page, in the same flat voice I'd used to write it in the first place. A defense investigator tried, in a pre-trial deposition, to suggest I'd coached Theo, that a college dropout with an unfinished social work degree wasn't qualified to recognize what I claimed to have recognized. Detective Castellane, sitting 2 seats down from me at the time, didn't say a single word in response. She didn't have to. The dates in that notebook kept lining up, one after another, with something else entirely. A bank record, an insurance filing, a phone log pulled from a tower near the storage unit that I'd had no possible way of knowing about when I wrote them down in a drugstore notebook at my kitchen table. At the grand jury, an assistant district attorney named Priya Kowalski, young, precise, visibly furious in a way she kept carefully contained, walked 12 jurors through exhibit after exhibit. Exhibit D was my notebook. Exhibit E was the mocked-up Guardian paperwork built off Colton Reyes's stolen letterhead. Exhibit F was the beneficiary change form Owen Ferris had pulled up on his monitor, printed now and enlarged so the mismatched signature was visible from the back row. Exhibit G was the lockbox inventory from the storage unit. By the time she reached Exhibit J, the tow truck mechanic's sworn statement about the brake line, 2 jurors were openly taking their own notes, and I understood, watching that room, what Detective Castellane had meant about a pattern being the thing that finally makes people look. The insurance company suspended Grant's adjuster's license within a week of the arrest, pending its own internal investigation into whether he'd used his professional access to research payout structures on cases that weren't his. His soccer league quietly reassigned his team to another coach before the season's second half. No explanation given, none needed. A regional news station ran 2 segments on the case once the Marisol Fenn connection became public record. Segments Renee refused to appear in, though she didn't stop Detective Castellane or the DA's office from speaking on the record, because, she told me, some part of the story wasn't only theirs to keep quiet about anymore. I started having my own trouble sleeping around the same time Theo started his sessions with Dr. Anand, though it took me longer to admit it needed a name. I'd wake up at 2 a.m. certain I'd heard a car in the driveway, certain the notebook wasn't where I'd left it, and lie there running dates in my head like a rosary until the sky started to lighten. My roommate finally sat me down over cold coffee one Sunday and told me gently that I sounded like someone who needed to talk to a professional and not just a friend who worked nights. I started seeing a counselor at the community college's student health center, technically still enrolled for exactly this kind of thing, and she told me what I already half knew, that documenting a slow-motion threat to a child you loved for 11 straight weeks without being able to tell anyone one, had cost me something even if the ending had turned out as well as it possibly could have. I still keep the appointments. Some habits, it turns out, you build in a crisis and then can't quite justify putting down once the crisis is over. Theo still sees Dr. Anand, down to once a week now instead of twice. He calls Judith and Walt every single Sunday, still keeps ramen on his pillow, still corners anyone who will hold still long enough to hear about neutron stars. A few weeks ago, walking him home from school past the reservoir turnoff, neither of us mentions out loud. He asked me, not in that flat, coached cadence anymore, just an ordinary kid's ordinary question, whether the house was really theirs now, no asterisks, no papers anyone else could touch. I told him yes. He thought about that for about a block and a half, kicking a rock along the sidewalk, and then said, good, and went back to telling me about Saturn's rings like nothing had happened at all. The trial is still months out. Grant's new attorney has already floated, twice, that the storage unit tools prove nothing on their own, that a compromised brake line could have happened a dozen innocent ways, that a boy's questions about pills and paper and secrets are the kind of thing any 9-year-old might say for any number of reasons that have nothing to do with a stepfather waiting on a payout. He isn't entirely wrong that a single line in a notebook on its own doesn't prove anything at all. What he keeps leaving out, every time, is that nobody ever built this case out of a single line. They built it out of 11 weeks of them, dated the same day they happened, in the same flat handwriting, sitting untouched on a kitchen table until the exact night they finally mattered. Renee still keeps the Brontosaurus mug on the counter. She bought a second notebook, identical to my first one, and keeps it in the drawer under the phone charger. Not because she expects to need it again, she told me once, but because some habits you don't put down just because the danger's finally passed. I understood exactly what she meant. I still have mine too.